I'm recording a presentation for this White Lotus Day observation in order to honor the lasting legacy of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. I don't elevate her as any kind of guru or an infallible teacher. I am quite sure she wouldn't have even put up with any kind of adulation or hero worship in any case. Like so many of us in the Theosophical Society, though, I have studied her life, at least what we know of it, and her life's work. I am amazed at what she accomplished during a time when it would have been easy to shut down and give up, especially given that she was a woman in a time when that put her at a pretty major disadvantage. I do imagine that she was strong enough to overcome most of the obstacles that her gender presented to her during her lifetime. It might be important to realize that women of her time were not allowed to speak in church or at political gatherings, and there were no women who taught at schools, were reporters, worked in an office, or were professionals at all, for that matter. Most women used a male pseudonym to get published. Women only began doing nursing, for example, in 1854. Women could not travel unaccompanied without a man, even two women together. Cultural context matters, and yet she became the mother of the New Age, as I have entitled this talk. In her time, somehow women were allowed to give public speeches, and I suspect that in a time without radios and televisions, a lot more people across Europe, the United States, and Canada read multiple newspapers and read lots of books. If she was coming to town, people showed up. And I will get into this later, but I also suspect plenty of pastors and the churchgoers also put in an appearance to heckle her or to try to convert the people as they came out of her talks. She became the mother of the New Age because she accepted the mission given to her by the masters. Madame Blavatsky became the mother of the New Age the moment that she accepted the mission. She was warned of the difficulties, and at the age of 20, she still said yes, undergoing arduous initiations around the world, possibly at least at my count, maybe 8 initiations in different traditions over 10 years of traveling. Now, this is completely my idea, but I have the strongest impression that the masters, the Mahatmas, looked into the future and saw that humanity needed a very specific intervention to withstand and evolve with the coming energetic changes that would be altering the people and the planet around the year 2000 with the changing of the age of Aquarius and with what some have called the quickening or the hastening. I think that first they sent HPV and then she laid the groundwork for the others who came after her to seed new thought and new energy into the Western world. And there were so many that came after her. This plan was crucial because this part of the world would have the highest technologies to utilize the seeded energy and upgraded ideas. She also is the mother of the New Age because of her message. That message got out first through her talks and articles, and then through her extensive authorship of books. As commonplace as these terms are now, the idea of karma, energy centers or chakras, the idea of an astral body, and reincarnation would have been unknown in the Western world prior to HPV. However, with the publishing of Isis Unveiled, the universal laws were introduced to the West. With the popularity of that book, the concept of karma, dharma, the human soul's spiritual evolution through reincarnation were broadcast in public talks across the United States and Europe. She bridged the East to the West in a way that had not been possible before, largely due to her as the messenger being a white, wealthy, more acceptable woman. She was not showing up as the guru in robes. It is also true that Hindu concepts and even Buddhist ideas stayed in the East due to language barriers, true, but also because most Western minds were not open to what they felt were foreign ways and traditions up until that point. She also brought clarity. From her first book and then throughout her writing career, Madame Blavatsky used her considerable intellect to clarify religious thought and to challenge conventional ideas that had kept religion and science completely apart up until that time. She did not allow emotional ideas to hold sway in her dissertation about religious thought as she spoke about religion. She challenged the ideas and practices of spiritualism that she observed, even though positioning herself with them would have given her an audience that already aligned with her. In some ways, she risked alienating all the camps, the scientific community, the traditionally religious, and spiritualists, by speaking her mind and staying true to her mission. First, in reference to the scientific community, she spoke out against the growing adherence to materialism that denied the human soul for the sake of science. And yet, her writing won over the likes of Albert Einstein and Thomas Edison. And granted, she probably totally freaked out the traditionally religious with her denial of hell and really most of the content of the Isis Unveiled first book and then onward. And related to spiritualism, she spoke out against the dangers and the pitfalls of relying on psychism. By calling out the flaws in spiritualism, she alienated a large audience demographic of her most likely potential audience. But with her developed psychic abilities, she was able to see that spiritualism was not accessing the actual discarnate people that they wanted to communicate with, but was simply being toyed with by something else willing to play in the astral realm. In keeping true to her mission and keeping true to this clarity that she had, she created and preserved a clear path to the New Age by debunking a ton of nonsense in, let's be honest, all of these camps. With the current measurable advances in quantum physics, it is only now that we can understand just how grounded Madame Blavatsky was in her perspectives on religion and science, even if evangelical Christians probably have not given up on their ideas of hell and will never embrace her books or really any theosophical authors who came after her. So I've created this rather extensive chart to outline the cultural and religious environment out of which Madame Blavatsky operated throughout her career and while she was building the Theosophical Society. I think seeing this laid out will help you understand why she is worth honoring for her accomplishments and what she had to persevere against, and also what she ceded for those who came after her. Now, perhaps I have a rather dubious distinction of knowing the religious history of the mid-1800s up to really kind of current time very well of both the United States and Europe due to my 5 years worth of education at a Baptist Bible college. Now, I'm not saying that I actually attended there for 5 years. I squished it all into 4 years, and maybe that was more painful. But let's just say that I have a pretty good idea of the likely resistance that Helena Blavatsky faced when she toured around the United States and Europe after writing Isis Unveiled. And I just appreciate that she persevered through that. But before that, I wanted to talk about the first piece, which is the rise of spiritualism. Spiritualism developed and reached its peak growth in membership from the 1840s to the 1920s. So it was well entrenched by the time she was there in 1877. And this was true especially in the English-speaking countries. One aspect of these methods gaining such popularity is because it really preyed upon, in some ways, the grief of widows who lost so many men during the Civil War in the 1860s. Because most Christian churches had not portrayed heaven as an actual place where people could go, whether Protestant or Catholic, the discussions were so vague that this spiritualism belief allowed loved ones to know that their family and friends still were somewhere and could communicate back to them. By 1897, spiritualism was said to have more than 8 million followers in the United States and Europe, mostly drawn from the middle and upper classes, as they said. That's likely more than about 2% of available population, given at that time there were only 375 million people in the US and Europe. I looked it up. Soon, spiritual mediums could be found in almost every town. One of the reasons this movement also gained so much traction was that for a time, spiritualism was the only way women were allowed to speak in public. Female mediums used this as a way to champion the ideas of women's suffrage, equal rights, and the abolition of slavery, claiming that these weren't their ideas, but rather messages from the spirit realm. Now, because of those distortions and for the other reasons already mentioned, it became part of HPB's mission to clarify and clean up the frenzy and fervor that had grown up around spiritualism. It didn't make her popular with them, as I've said, but it was also important. As you can see on this chart, spiritualism did hold a grip on society for almost 100 years. So the second major influence around the time that Helena arrived in the United States had to do with these cycles of Christian revivals. So that's a period of 1860, really through 1905. And it rippled almost around the world. Now, we may not think of a revival as a great awakening in our terms, but that is what Christianity still calls these events because they consider the church at that time asleep and then waking up to Christ and conversion. Prior to revivals, Catholics and Protestants didn't speak in terms of conversion or use salvation by Jesus wording, but then the revival preachers did. So these names here, Radcliffe, Spurgeon, and even Booth, these are names that I knew, and they are still celebrated within the Christian ranks. And look, between 1857 to 1859, 1 million people were converted in the United States. But this was also happening over a 15-year period all over Europe and the United States. This was also in Canada, Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, South Africa, Spain, Russia. Churches were being built, missionaries were being sent out. And then another aspect was happening. There was an awakening to prayer. So part of the prayer movement began because in 1857, the stock market crashed and businessmen started daily morning prayer meetings. Many people were inspired then to pray together as well. And then preachers came out and started doing the revivals to capitalize on that new, more one-to-one relationship between prayer and God, which shifted within the churches. Now, interestingly enough, the churches did not allow these preachers, these itinerant preachers, to come into their pulpits in the church. And so the revival services happened out in the fields. And this backfired for the mainline churches because the fields allowed unlimited number of people to gather and to stay there for days. I remember so well that my grandparents talked about their parents going to week-long revival meetings in Sweden and how nothing felt the same after these ramped up environments of these fervent meetings. And my grandfather said that his parents longed for that kind of church setting that they never really found once they moved to the US. So Blavatsky arrived right in the middle of this amped up Christian expansion where powerful personalities were traveling from city to city and churches were being built. And even like the Salvation Army was spreading across the land. Somehow HPB still managed to appeal to a middle and upper class society of people in New York City and across the country, and she found her audience. She completed Isis Unveiled and sold 1,000 copies in 10 days, selling out the first print run. This is pretty astonishing for that time period when you look at what was in Isis Unveiled. And let me just pop over to the table of contents of that book. We will come back to this chart in a second, but I just have to point out a few of the phrases in just the table of contents that would have, like I said before, freaked out the conventional Christianity of the time. So especially, she starts out with science and religion, even just that itself, science and religion in one book, just sitting there, and introducing the idea of the astral light, just that term. Plus, in the chapter 16, Christian crimes and heathen virtues, really? Okay. And then divisions among the early Christians, talking about the Kabbalah, early Christian heresies, mentioning secret societies. Oh, yeah, not really. Comparing the Vedas and the Bible and saying that the devil was a myth. Yeah, that was not going to fly. So just I'm amazed she persevered. All right, so I had to point that out. So one last comment left on this chart is the revivals of the Fifth Awakening, because Dwight L. Moody may not be someone you are familiar with, but he had a major effect during the 1880s through to 1905. He did a lot of revival work. He traveled thousands of miles and preached to thousands of people across the United States and Europe. He created the first worldwide interdenominational student missionary movement, because up until then, there wasn't an outreach to go to other countries, but they even went into China. And he built the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago to bring the Bible to the regular people sitting in the pews. So then moving on, I wanted to talk about the seeds planted. So the first piece was of interest is that we have Jung embracing the Eastern philosophy, and HPV's writing in particular, as well as her successor, G.R.S. Mead. He was known to have read those books thoroughly, and he incorporated the ideas into his work. In 1913, Jung broke away from Freud, and by 1921, recognition of Jung's work was growing. He wrote Psychological Types. This is a copy of that book here. You can't really see it too well probably, but it introduced the idea of personality and personality types, something very common. We think about introvert and extrovert. These terms are so common to us now that we can't even imagine a time without such classifications. But at that time, the only application of psychology was a very medical psychoanalytic view that didn't take into account the spiritual aspects of life. So his incorporating the Eastern concepts into his writing and in his thought and into his practice really made a difference. And then to those therapists coming after, to the psychological developers and also to therapists. Finally, because of the seeds planted by the work of the Theosophical Society, when Paramahansa Yogananda arrived in California in 1920, I believe he arrived to find an accepting and wider audience. He toured extensively to huge crowds for a number of years, beginning in 1924, bringing the teaching of meditation and Kriya Yoga to the West. And I don't think that would have been possible without the Theosophical Society, without Annie Besant, without HPB, without Mead and others. Many other New Age teachers have built upon the work of Madame Blavatsky in the last 132 years, certainly since her passing on May 8, 1891. I sometimes wonder how much HPV was able to see into the future and how much she didn't say and how much she wasn't allowed to write. She was the trailblazer assigned a mission to communicate the ancient wisdom to the West by her masters that she served willingly and faithfully to the end. And certainly they kept her going, sometimes at the expense of her comfort for sure, especially towards the end of her life. She paid this price because she was chosen to translate the Eastern mysteries and to be the bridge between the East and a Western mind that needed to truly awaken just in the nick of time.